Welcome to another Tech Insight video where we show you how to make your workspace work. In this episode, we're going to show you how to use the Federated Authentication Service to provide single sign-on to virtual apps and desktop resources when a user authenticates to an environment where Workspace does not have access to an Active Directory user account information. In this side-by-side comparison, we have the same user authenticating to Citrix Workspace using an Okta identity. When the user tries to access a virtual app and desktop resource, the environment configured to use the Federated Authentication Service is able to provide single sign-on capabilities to the desktop that is expecting an Active Directory-based user account. Let's now take a conceptual look at why this is the case. When a user connects to the workspace and starts a virtual app and desktop session, the authentication to workspace in the virtual app and desktop session is based on the user's primary identity. If the user's authentication to Workspace uses Windows Active Directory, then the user will be automatically signed onto the virtual app and desktop session with pass-through authentication from Workspace. The virtual app and desktop instance uses the same identity provider as Workspace. But what if Workspace does not have access to Active Directory-based credentials? Instead, what if I'm signing into my Workspace with Okta? We have a mismatch between identity providers. Workspace uses Okta and the virtual desktop uses Active Directory. When the user launches a virtual app and desktop session, they will be required to authenticate against Active Directory. The same challenges arise if we use Google ID, or Azure AD, or any scenario where the identity provider microservice does not have access to the user's Active Directory information. With the Federated Authentication Service, we can have a user log into the workspace with a third-party identity provider like Okta, Google, or Azure, and Workspace will automatically sign them on to the virtual app and desktop session with an Active Directory-based virtual smart card. Let's dig a little deeper so we can better understand the overall architecture. Remember that Citrix Workspace is able to communicate with on-prem resources via the outbound control channel using the Cloud Connector. Our on-prem environment will also contain a Federated Authentication Service server that communicates with the Federated Authentication Service microservice within Citrix Cloud. This is also an outbound control channel connection. Each valid user account within the identity provider must have a corresponding account in Active Directory. The Active Directory username and password are irrelevant because the user will not know of the existence of this account. We just need the right set of claims that links a third-party identity provider account to an Active Directory account, which is the UPN. The AED accounts and groups are synchronized with a third-party identity provider. When a user connects to Workspace and authenticates with a third-party identity provider, it results in the identity provider replying with a set of claims about the user. Workspace uses those claims to determine which virtual app and desktop resources are authorized for the user. When the user selects a resource, Workspace requests a certificate ID via the Federated Authentication Service microservice. The request gets sent to an on-premises Federated Authentication Service server, which requests a virtual smart card from the Microsoft Certificate Services. This certificate is based for a user with the AD account corresponding to the UPN claims obtained for the user's account within the identity provider. When the user establishes the session to the virtual app and desktop, the host validates the certificate ID with the Federated Authentication Service server and the certificate service. In order to work properly, the Federated Authentication Service server and the virtual desktop and app must belong to the same Active Directory domain. Now that we understand how the Federated Authentication Service works, let's walk through the configuration. In this example, our Workspace environment is configured to use Okta as the primary identity provider. The first part of the configuration is to go to our on-premises Federated Authentication Service server and install the software as an admin. Once the installation is complete, we can go ahead and launch the management console and begin the initial configuration. The Federated Authentication Service uses a set of certificate templates to help with the virtual smart cards. We simply select the deploy option and these certificate templates are installed. We then need to publish those templates to our certificate authority. So hitting the publish button and selecting the correct certificate authority allows us to integrate those new certificates into our CA. We then authorize this service. So in order to fully authorize these certificates in this system with the CA, we have to go to our certificate authority and authorize the pending request. Once the request is approved, we can go back to the Federated Authentication Server and see that this service has now been authorized. We must now configure the rules for the Federated Authentication Service. The first one is to select the certificate that will be used for the virtual smart card. We also select the certificate authority that will be responsible for creating and managing the virtual smart cards. And because we're only using these virtual smart cards to help with the initial authentication, there's no need to make these available within the session. And because we're using Workspace Experience instead of Storefront, we don't have to incorporate this into our on-prem Storefront configuration. And finally, we need to identify which users and which virtual desktops and virtual apps will utilize the virtual smart cards. In this instance, we're going to set it to all. With the Federated Authentication Service installed and configured, with our certificate authority defined, our certificates deployed, our server authorized, and our rules created, we can now incorporate and integrate our on-prem Federated Authentication Service with our Citrix Cloud subscription. We do this by authenticating to Citrix Cloud as one of our Workspace administrators and selecting the appropriate customer ID and resource location to deploy the Federated Authentication Service. Once a link is created, we can then select the rule that will be used between the Federated Authentication Service and Citrix Cloud for this particular deployment. The service tries to finish the overall configuration, but we still have to go into Active Directory and configure the GPO appropriately. The Federated Authentication Service incorporates a group policy template that needs to be integrated into the Active Directory domain. Once added, we need to create a new group policy object for our Federated Authentication Service configuration or incorporate it into a previously created GPO. Within the computer configuration portion of our policies, we need to specify the DNS address for our Federated Authentication Services servers. Each on-prem service that we deploy should have a corresponding entry within this policy. Once the policy is created, we need to link it to an OU that contains our VDAs as well as our Citrix Virtual App and Desktop Delivery Controllers. Once our group policies are refreshed on our Federated Authentication Service, the status of the service should now be available. Once we've completed setting up our on-premises Federated Authentication Service server, we can now log into our Citrix Cloud admin account to enable the Federated Authentication Service option for our configured identity provider. By incorporating the Federated Authentication Service within Citrix Workspace, organizations are no longer tied to Active Directory as their primary identity provider.